due to the pandemic, we had some shifts in seasonality. And because we talk about intensities, I think it's worth mentioning that the high season, so for us, the high season is July and August, actually in the last year was much higher than it was before the pandemic. So people have concentrated their holidays in high season in summer when we had already some overcrowding problems in some specific parts of the province. Anyway, so to give you a context to start with, I just wanted to briefly recap who we are. Our observatory was launched in 2018, and we believe it's pretty much important for us not just to support evidence-based policy making, but also to network and to keep a good relationship with all the important stakeholders at local and global level. That's why we engage a lot also in partnerships and activities with the local destination management organization and also with other actors such as the fair we mentioned yesterday and other actors. Why are intensities so important? So why should we care about differentiating tourism intensities in space and time? Well, I just tried to put a little bit of my thoughts in these slides to highlight when we notice the need and the usefulness of having measured intensities. So the first reason why we started using an indicator for intensity was to cluster municipal data. So we have 116 municipalities in our region, and we immediately noticed we cannot share and put into the report the data for the entire municipalities one by one. We needed to aggregate those municipalities, but on the other hand, also aggregate to a provincial level was a big loss of information. That's why we started to think about ways to differentiate between highly touristic municipalities, middle ones, and lower touristic municipalities. The second reason why was the need to have differentiated tourism policies, and that was a request from the local government that, as we mentioned yesterday, decided to put a moratorium, so a maximum limit of bed capacities, and of course they would have liked, or they were planning to have differentiated maximum limits based on the fact that there was or wasn't the possibility to grow in the specific municipality. So the need for differentiated policies requires us to have a differentiated observation of intensities. On the other hand, also the management of peak seasons, peak moments, or the management of hotspots. That's more or less the same principle with high concentration in space and time. And also because we know that some infrastructural investments are long-term, knowing about intensities at spatial level gives us the possibility to make better choice when it comes to deciding where to put new infrastructures. And related to that, the fact of the possibility to create agglomeration economies, small clusters, or places where we have a higher density of tourism services. Of course, this topic was discussed a lot in literature. On the one hand, it's good to have agglomeration. On the other hand, of course, there's always the risk of having segregation of tourism areas, which is again not good. So these reasons were the ones that forced us or enabled us to think about an indicator, a composite indicator for intensity. The final goal was to provide this indicator to the local government. The reports you see on the top right part of this slide are the reports of one big policy support with it over the last 2 years, actually. And this support was exactly to enable the local government to take some decisions when it came to the moratorium, so the maximum limit of beds per municipality, and also the definition of development strategies for tourism in the future. Since we would have liked, or we decided to make a differentiation in the different strategies, we worked on this tourism exposure index. First of all, our starting point was to understand what kind of indicator was more appropriate to give a picture of intensities. So we talked about overnight stays, bed capacities, employees, and many other indicators. We tried to look into those indicators and define the ones that were more appropriate. The second step was to define this so-called tourism exposure, and then to use it or to standardize it in a way that we had an equal weighting of intensity and density and a comparable measurement of the selected indicator to create our index. Finally, we decided how to classify municipalities, and we also in this case considered different ways of doing that. I will show you in a second. So after having compared many different alternative options to analyze the intensity, for instance, the bed density, the employees, the occupation rates of the hotels, and many other indicators, we decided to use simple indicators in the end, because we noticed that a lot of these indicators are quite highly correlated. So we tested for correlation, and for instance, tourism intensity, so the average daily overnights per population, was really highly correlated with the percentage of employees in the hotel and food service sector. Of course, if we have arrivals and overnights, we have more seasonal workers. That's why basically we had the impression, and we could statistically prove it, that the content of this or the information derivable by these two indicators, so number 2 and number 3, were very, very similar. That's why after a lot of comparisons, we decided to focus on bed density as an indicator of the supply side, so the amount of beds per square kilometers, and the tourism intensity, as I said before, the average daily overnights per population. We treated those two indicators as having an average equal weight. And of course, we needed to standardize them because they were different figures, different numbers, right? And we standardized them having the mean equal to 0 and the deviation from the mean measured in terms of standard deviation. That's why we have an indicator that for the municipalities that are in the middle, more or less, is very close to 0. And the more the municipality is taking a distance, both in positive or negative terms, from the average of the region, the more it's high or low in the figure. So we calculated the average of both, and we had also to take the final decision, as I mentioned before, about how to classify the indicators, because after having calculated these intensities in form of this composite index, we had a kind of ranking. So we had those municipalities that were higher, those municipalities that were lower, but this information, this ranking of 160 municipalities was far away from giving us the right recommendations for policymakers. That's why we discussed with our policymakers a couple of solutions. The first one, the one we then chose, was to work with the so-called quartiles. So 25% of municipalities that had a higher exposure could be considered municipalities with high tourism intensity. The 50% in the middle, medium, and the lowest 25%, the ones with low exposure. This classification has a lot of advantages, but also a lot of disadvantages, because you always have to make a cut, and it's always after the 25% of the municipalities. So you take the lower, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are low compared, for instance, with another region. Depending on the distribution of these different intensities, we could have chosen also another way of dividing and selecting the municipalities, for instance, the ones of percentiles, where we could have put 10%, 20%, 15%, depending also on the way the intensities were distributed. Or finally, we discussed a lot to have also no categorization, to have just a ranking and a more smooth distinction between high and low tourism exposure. In the end, we chose the first one, so the one with quartile, and we are now refining this indicator, and I'll show you how. We are having some meetings with stakeholders to fine-tune the indicator, because of course these are very simple data, the ones we took. We really decided to take simple data to have this classification of municipalities. And once we use this very simple and available data and updated data to classify municipalities, we can then look into the intensities of all the other indicators. Just for instance, how is the water consumption in those municipalities that are low exposure? How is the quality of the accommodation in those that are high exposure, and so on and so forth. We also analyze possible alternatives of indicators, and particularly one I would like to highlight. We were a little bit criticized because we decided to use the measurement of beds per surface by referring to a general surface of the municipality. And as I've shown you, our region is quite mountainous. That's why not all the surface of a municipality is usable. And in some cases, we have big surface, but with forests, with different surfaces that with rocks that we cannot really consider as part of the usable land. That's why we tried to update and change the indicator. Here you can see the first result with our indicator for general terms of the surface. So we have the classification between high, medium, and low. The part in the bottom right of the region, so here, this part is exactly the one with highest intensities and also with the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the middle part of the region seems to be kind of lower intensity. Once we refined the indicator and used the usable surface to calculate bed densities, so not only the entire surface of the land, but also the one that was usable to produce or to build infrastructures, we had another picture, and this is the second one here. So you can see the difference. 14 municipalities were changing their attribution from low to high, from high to low, or from low to medium, mostly just one step, from low to medium, from medium to low, or from high to medium, or medium to high. But anyway, this calculation was refined, and we think it's much better. The only thing is that this data about the usable surface, they are available just every 5 years. So we cannot update the indicator every year. We need to accept that to have better accuracy, we need to update it every 5 years. But anyway, here you can see also this is the municipal level, the yellow one is a bigger region. We can see more homogeneity in the distribution of high, medium, and low exposure. And looking into the specific cases, we think that this is really more accurate. As I said before, this is the option where we cut based on quartiles, but we could also have a look at the different shades. And this is made without having any category, but just looking at the gradients. And again, you can see this part of the region is the one with highest exposure. And then the middle part of the region is quite less touristic. And this reflects exactly the picture we have from a perceptual point of view. So to conclude, what have we learned with this short exercise? First of all, I think we've learned that there's a high correlation between the different indicators for intensities. Of course, tourists' behavior plays a role in the differences, so in shaping the differences between intensities, because of course, if I think about the water consumption in a high tourism exposure municipality, and if the tourists tend to use a lot of water, I will have an over than average water consumption per capita. But in general, there is a really high correlation between those indicators. So I don't want to say they're substitutable, but maybe we should pick the simplest one to start a categorization, because they can give us a first overview, and then look with the more precise ones into the differences between the different municipalities. Depending on how these intensities are calculated, there is a difference in correlation that is perceivable. For instance, if we look at the correlation between bed density and tourism intensity with the normal surface, with the total surface, or with the with a settlement surveys, then we have a difference in correlation. The context of measurement has also a big effect on the measurement itself. On the one hand, as I mentioned, the availability of data, the granularity of data, so the fact that we have or don't have that data at municipal level, of course, they both have a big effect on the measurement quality. But also the method for the calculation has an effect on the results. For instance, the fact that we are a mountainous area and we decided to pick the simple calculation of the surface, which is, by the way, the standard indicator used by all statistical offices, the locals, the European, and so on, that was providing a distortion, that was implying a distortion, a bias for our region that is, as I said, not characterized by a constant share of settlement surface compared to the total surface. So what we have learned is that multiple calculations, adjusting and refining procedures, and of course the discussion of those indicators for intensities with stakeholders, with local people that know exactly the characteristics of each municipalities, they are really fundamental to have a good fine-tuning of indicators, and of course to have better indicators in the end. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to all the team of the observatory that has worked on this calculation and on this project, particularly on Maximilian Walder. And I'm happy to answer any question if you have some.
Anna. Wow.
Yes.
No, not yes. Wow. No, thank you very much for this presentation. As communications over here, it seemed to be a bit interrupted, at least from the way as you described from our side to your side. I condensed my statement. But at the same time, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
No, it's not over. I want to allow questions here from the room right now for Anna, as she's not available for any coffee talk. Are there questions here in the room? Anna, your contact details, if they have not been seen here, the PowerPoint as usual will be uploaded, but any here in the room being interested, and I'm pretty sure.
Of course, at any time you can contact me. I'm available for any questions or even talks.